everybody, it's Brian Loans, lead broadcaster for the NHRA Professional Drag Racing Series and the editor of Hot Rod, John McGann. And on this episode of the Hot Rod Pod, where it all began, Laurent Potdevin is coming on right now. And we're going to call him LP for the whole show because he is from France. And I've just probably offended everyone French by pronouncing his name wrong. But this is a fascinating guy.
He's just taken over as CEO of the Roadster Shop. And he's a guy who's built or been involved with building brands from Louis Vuitton, Burton Snowboards, and Lululemon.
Lululemon, Tom's, and it's been in that fashion and sports arena where he spent most of his life.
And and was involved with taking what was a company that was this big and turned it into something that was like gigantic. Everyone wears yoga pants.
Yeah, his math is different than Hot Rodder math, where we buy a car for this much and sell it for this much. He actually begins here and ends here. But this is a conversation about business. It's a conversation about his philosophy. It's a conversation about what the aftermarket looks like to a fresh set of eyes from other industries. And I'll be honest, John, this one kind of over-delivered for me because I think he educated me on some stuff that I never would have thought of otherwise.
I agree. And it was a great conversation about, you have disparate brands within an organization and how do they work together and how do you market one or how do you use the assets of one to build up another brand or to support another brand. And, that translates into all kinds of different, we as our publishing company, you guys with the NHRA, it's really an interesting take on making lots of disparate things work together.
Conversation about passion, conversation about parts, conversation about performance, and how he is going to take all three to the next level of the Roadster Shop. Enjoy this conversation with LP. And our guest today is Laurent Potdevin, who is the CEO of the Roadster Shop, and who, John, will be known as LP for the rest of the show, because that's the only time I was going to get that halfway right.
Sounds good to me, and thank you for being here.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Laurent, this is going to be a pretty interesting conversation. The course of this podcast so far, we've talked to car builders and engine builders and racers. We're talking now to a brand builder. We're talking now to a business builder. And so where it all began is part of the title of this show. So for you, I want to know where it began, A, in business, and B, where it began in cars for you as well.
Where it began in cars. It began in Europe. So I grew up in France and in Switzerland. So I think it was a combo of rally and Formula One.
That's good. That's good.
That's a great combination.
And growing up in Switzerland, I was right at the bottom of the Alps, so it was sort of ground zero for rally.
That's fantastic.
we would be sitting like a couple feet away from the cars, like driving
guys sliding around the corners
in full drift. Those Renault 5 Turbo 2 and
the old Group B cars, right?
Exactly.
1,000 horsepower all-wheel drive Group B cars. Yeah,
exactly. That's really, and then growing up, in a part of the world where you have a lot of snow. I mean, you love to. It was like early days of drifting before drifting, right? So that's where it really started. Always have been passionate about cars, but in Europe, you got to wait until you're 18 to get your driver's license. Then it's really expensive to get your driver's license. Then gas is really expensive. So there are quite a few hurdles to getting behind the wheel, but
that also is one of those things too where we talk about people's passions and you that day, like as you build up to that day when you're 18 and you build up to that day where you have enough money in your back pocket to buy a car, that has to be part of the process as well.
Oh, it is. You get all the car magazines from age 14, and then you get into RC, car building, and electric, and then gas, and then you finally get your first little Peugeot, and you're not thrilled about it, but you're so happy to have a car.
And so in terms of business, you hold an engineering degree, of course, and you hold an MBA. So when you were studying engineering in France, what style of engineering was it? And obviously your direction has taken you into the world of business, but your education, let's talk about that.
Yeah. I think for the longest time I had no clue what I wanted to do, which took me to engineering school. I mean, I followed some of my friends, got into a pretty good engineering school in Switzerland, and so got a master's in microelectronics. Loved going to school for it. I mean, didn't think I ever wanted to be an engineer, but school was great, and it was close to the mountains and close to the lake, and, nothing's wrong with that. And then not wanting to be an engineer, I mean, I got an opportunity to do my MBA in Paris. And then one thing led to another. I got into this program on the management of luxury brands. And so learned a lot about luxury brand craftsmanship, really got into what it takes to build a brand, got really passionate about that, and that sort of took me away from engineering forever.
And what's interesting to me as we get deeper into this conversation is that, we talk about engineering and we look at the cold analytics of whether it's microelectronics, whether it's building a bridge, and then we look at this idea of building a brand and building especially a luxury brand, which is the opposite of that, right? It's you need to appeal to people's senses and need to appeal to the things that are anathema to math. You need to appeal to all the human stuff. So how does being an engineer play into helping you be a brand builder, which you've been your whole career?
You know what? It's interesting. I mean, I think being an engineer, it forces you to be curious, right? And I think that curiosity at the end of the day helps with everything. I mean, whether you're building a brand, whether you're trying to solve a problem, whether it's leadership and you're dealing with people, being curious, I think is such an amazing leadership trait. And I think I'm a very curious guy by nature. But so I think engineering it trains your brain to be curious and to solve problems, find solutions for problems that people don't know they have. And often some of the most creative brands actually have been led by really, really talented engineers. So I mean, I think there is a real correlation between that left brain and that right brain. I mean, it's interesting.
We were talking about Lululemon and how you turn something as simple as like clothes that people wear to work out into a fashion statement, and how that becomes sort of a ubiquitous thing. How does that happen? And how do you come up with that idea too? Like, let's build a brand around something that's like people would consider casual clothes.
So first of all, I've got to give credit where credit is due. Like by the time I joined Lululemon, it was already a $1 billion business, right? So I took it from $1 billion to $3.5 billion. So I mean, what I did really when I was there, I mean, I got there after they had a lot of quality issues. So that's where the engineering degree comes into mind, because as you scale an organization, you got to make sure that everything follows, right? Quality and supply chain, and so I think that's where the engineering degree comes into play. But the way Lululemon became this aspirational brand, and Tom's before that, or you look at Burton snowboard. I joined Burton when it was about $100 million organization. By 2007, it was close to a billion, right? It went from this countercultural, dope smoking kid on the chairlift to an Olympic sport, right? And I think that staying true to and being a leader in your industry, really always came back to being passionate, focused on the rider, the snowboarders, the yoga instructor at Lululemon, and really focusing on product and product innovation.
One of the great stories that I want you to tell is that first meeting with Jake Burton.
Oh, that meeting.
Because I feel like, and because to me it speaks to your ability to also become part of what you're working with. So I tell this story because I think it's great.
All right, so it is 1995, and I was working with Louis Vuitton at the time. So I was working in New York. I had been sent by Louis Vuitton from Paris to New York, and a headhunter had been speaking to me about joining Burton, which was based in Vermont, and it had a lot of appeal because in engineering school I had built a bunch of snowboards.
Okay.
And you couldn't get on the chairlift; it was illegal. And so my buddy and I gave up on snowboarding and went back to skiing. But we had built a few snowboards, and so an opportunity to meet with Jake Burton was really exciting. And get back into the sports world was interesting as well. So I was flying back from Asia, and we met in Phoenix, where he had a board meeting for SI, the Ski Industry of Americas. And I remember going to that interview, and I was going to a job interview, so I was dressed up like I used to dress up every day, right? I had a suit, tie, cufflinks. I had a beautiful briefcase. I was shiny. And I knock on Jake's door, and he opens the door, and he's naked out of the shower, wrapped in a towel, with mountain bikes, muddy mountain bikes everywhere. And he looks at me and he's like, "Oh, you're overdressed." So, it was like this 20 seconds of sheer embarrassment. Then I took my tie off, I took my jacket off, cufflinks off, and then we ended up spending, I think, 4.5 hours together. And I missed a couple planes, and then the rest is history. We ended up spending 15 years together.
One of the things you mentioned about snowboarding, and it correlates to drag racing to a degree, because drag racing was this activity that was kind of a nuisance to people. It was done kind of in the back areas. No one paid attention to it. The police would come and yell at you if you were doing it on the street. And eventually it becomes this organized thing that now is a major global motorsport. Snowboarding really followed the same path, right? As you mentioned, it was a nuisance. It was discouraged. And next thing you know, it's in the Olympics. As a guy who was part of that evolution, how much does understanding that growth of an activity or brand help you as we now talk about your automotive forays now?
I think I think about what I've done at Louis Vuitton in a real luxury world, or at Burton in the sports world, or at Tom's in social impact, or Lululemon back in the sports/fashion world. Being a leader and literally taking a stance for who you want to be in that industry is so incredibly critical. And everywhere I've been, I've loved the people I've worked with. I've loved the category that I was in, and the product. And every time when we've done our best work, it's because we were focused on the ultimate enthusiast. Whether it's a snowboarder, whether it's a driver, and on product innovation.
Who do you want to be in this industry? You mentioned making that statement of who you want to be in this industry. Who does LP want to be in the automotive aftermarket?
Who do I want to be? Not so much about me, I guess, but rather the brands that we represent. I think I want to be a portfolio of brand that is recognized for leading through product innovation, passion, and delivering what people expect from us to deliver, right? I think we see way too much consolidation in the industry.
Yes.
And I'm really passionate about product innovation, continuing to do what we love to do, right? And really focusing on the end user, in our case, like the enthusiast, the driver. Yeah. We see too much consolidation, thinking that an engineer can apply their engineering skills to anything they do, and same thing with marketing, where every brand in our portfolio has got its own soul, right? Whether it's coming from drifting, whether it's coming from drag racing, or whether it's coming from, restoration with Roadster Shop. All these brands have such strong heritage. They're so authentic. And I think we can be really strong together, but the last thing I want to do is rip the soul out of those brands.
Well, yeah, and I think, in my estimation, we talk about consolidation like you brought up, and like anything else in the world, there's a right way and a wrong way. I think we've seen the wrong way to what you're saying is these companies will envelop a brand and then just gut the thing and just hang on to the fancy logo that they got with it. And with that, it scares a lot of people, enthusiasts. It scares them because that's been more the norm than what you're talking about, in that you bring these companies into a situation where they can all help each other, but yet you maintain what made them good in the first place.
Yeah, I think not only we maintain what's made them good in the first place, but we also bring more to it, right? So if you think about what automotive can bring to the Roadster Shop and vice versa, I think these brands can really work together and sort of bring the best out of each other. And it's not a cost cutting or a synergy exercise, which we see a lot of,
sure,
right? But it's rather like a growth story. I hate it, sort of, it's been said way too often, but it's that 1 + 1 = 3. But I actually really feel like what we're building right now is really unique, and gives us a really strong platform to play with.
I'm happy you said that, the 1 + 1 = 3, because we hear the word synergy a lot at work. And,
yes.
Synergy is probably one of the most overused words in business, I think. That and branding, or but I hear a lot of that. And as I was listening to you, it's like that's such a murky topic of branding and what that is. And we're going through a little bit of that right now as in the publishing company, transitioning more and more into long form video initially, and then shorter form video. And just the overall company, what's the direction? And you can see where raw enthusiasm can be good, but then also like lead you astray, or you kind of get lost in that you don't see the forest through the trees. Like,
you get fixated on different things.
Right. And so it's I like how you were saying it's almost like the analytical part of being an engineer helps you sort of, I don't know, compartmentalize or prioritize things in a way that you can like focus on getting the job done.
Absolutely. And I think, synergies, efficiencies, there's nothing wrong with that, right? You just have to be really clear about where you apply those concepts. If it comes to like supply chain, sourcing, legal, technology,
all that stuff makes total
finance.
sense.
You want to be as ruthlessly efficient as possible, right? So that you can reinvest in what makes you truly like who you are, product, sales, and marketing. It's like the triangle of product, sales, and marketing is what's going to drive us into who we want to be in the future and who we are today, right? And so I want to be as efficient as possible. I want the train to run on time for all of our brands as efficiently as possible so that we can really focus a lot of our human capital, a lot of our financial resources towards innovation.
So what attracted you to the Roadster Shop? There's a lot of obvious things. It is a rock solid brand. They are a company that I think all of us look forward to show season in this business because we know something's coming out of that shop that's either going to surprise us or take whatever element that they're working on to the next grade up, whether it's classic trucks that they've been delving into that elevate those, whether it's all the other like muscle car pro touring stuff they've done. So from a raw business standpoint, what made sense for the Roadster Shop to become the flagship?
It's I think first of all, I met Phil and Jeremy a little bit over a year ago, and Jeremy and I drove the same car, so I think that was part of like that.
That helps.
There was a good connection to
it never hurts
to start with. But I think you've I always say like it's one thing to as a brand have good product, right? And it's no small feat to just deliver consistently good product, right? And then a step above that is to have a good brand delivering good product. I think what Phil and Jeremy have built at Roadster Shop is a really, truly aspirational brand.
Yes.
And that is sort of the holy grail of branding, right? I think that what they've done over the past 20 years is that they've built a beautiful brand that is incredibly aspirational. That is aspirational to a very wide audience, a very wide demographic, right? You could be an 18-year-old and love the Roadster Shop. You could be a 65-year-old and love the Roadster Shop, or a guy or woman and equally love the brand. And I think that's really, really unique. They're obviously a very good chassis builder, but they also build some of the most amazing cars, right?
Oh, they do.
And they have amazing taste. They've got their finger on the pulse. They're trendsetter. And I think that was really appealing to me when we started talking, because we have, at the Automotive Group, we have good brands, right?
Yes.
Automotive, Pertronics, Taylor. Taylor's a 100-year-old brand. We've got really good assets. I didn't necessarily have the best platform to have all the brands talk to each other.
Yeah.
But now, I've got the Roadster Shop as the umbrella brand that's very aspirational. The chassis, which is the foundation of their business, as like the best platform to put some of, when it makes sense.
Yeah.
The Automotive Group
Yeah.
brand on the chassis. And so, it's a very unique opportunity. And we're super excited about it because it sort of, it meshes with the way I think about product innovation, and brand building at the same time.
And with all the respect due, I think there are brands in your portfolio that will benefit from being associated with the Roadster Shop. Brands like Pertronics, great solid products. Don't think they get the love probably they deserve. Taylor as well. You mentioned that's a 100-year-old brand. So many people use Taylor wires, especially in the world I come from in drag racing. They're all over the place. But again, it's not a brand that a lot of the typical John Q. Public hot rodder guy will default to. But when he starts seeing it in the places you're talking about seeing it, that to me is a total perception change.
I think you're absolutely right. And in some ways we're going to have to do some work, right? If you think about JBA and dogs, we're going to, we've been working really hard this past year to raise the level of quality and to come up with like new product, like all the stainless steel headers.
Yes.
It's going to tie in with Roadster Shop really well. But you're right, in the automotive group, I mean, we've got a number of brands that have been transacted on like twice in the past 3 years.
Yeah.
And every time that happens, product innovation like takes a bit of a side seat,
Sure.
right? Marketing takes a little bit of a side seat. And so this past year, we've really focused on reigniting the pipeline of innovation and launching new product. We just launched a whole lot of new product at SEMA, and that's exciting. But you're right, like a lot of the brands will benefit from the association, both from a going to market strategy, but also from a product development standpoint.
Oh, for sure. I want you to relate some of your stories you had in Vegas to show your hands-on ability. You went out and worked on an A-fuel injected dragster in Vegas. And I think this is a story that needs to be told because, listen, in this industry, as big or as small as it is, when a new face arrives from outside our tiny little scope, people are always skeptical. And so I want you to talk about working with Randy Meyer, who is a nice man, but on race weekend, we don't qualify him as a nice guy. So talk about your experience working on a nitro dragster.
You know what, first of all, I mean, I think it's fair for people to be skeptical, right? Because I don't come from this industry. I mean, I've been passionate about cars my whole life.
Yeah.
Still am. I still go shopping on the weekend for cars when I don't need a car. So, but I certainly did not know anything about the drag racing industry.
Yeah.
And last year, at the NHRA race in Vegas before SEMA, that was my first time, and that's where I met Randy. And Randy was the nicest guy. I mean, I could not have thought about a better person just to bring me in and sort of show me behind the scene, how it works. So last year, I helped him put a clutch back together, and we were talking about the different elements of the engine and what he's struggling with, where our brands could help him. Be more consistent with performance or whatever he needs. And so this year I went back and I spent the whole Saturday afternoon, I think I spent 5 hours going back from the laptop and looking at the telemetry and the flow rate and the return of fuel and learning so much. I mean, he was such a gentleman in really taking the time to educate me and show me what matters and what doesn't matter and being really honest about, where we could do a better job. And we actually took pictures of the product and brought that right back to our engineers. But loved it.
What did you were telling? Brian was telling me the story ahead of time.
The clutch, didn't he talk to you about setting the clutch up?
Yeah. It's sort of. I mean, he really was handing me the plates and telling me where to put them. So there was a lot of education involved. And then we looked at the teller, like spark plug wires, and how quickly they ripped them out of the engine after the race, and where we could sort of improve some of our qualities. Yeah. But I think it goes back to curiosity, right?
Sure.
And having a willingness to learn and knowing what you're great at and where you can bring something to the table and where you just need to listen and observe.
Well, just the spectacle of watching a top fuel engine being rebuilt after each run too. That's a thrill. I like that.
It's crazy. Like Julie had just gone through a race and passed the finish line. One of the pieces went straight through the engine block, and they're going to rebuild it, and an hour later they're going to be right back at it.
Right.
It's an amazing. It really is an amazing thing, and I think it speaks to the commitment, because there's not a lot of guys in your position that will go out there and do that. And that's, to me, the type of thing that shows people it's not a sideshow. You're not out there with a camera crew following you around saying, "Look what I'm doing here." You're doing it because you want to understand at a very basic level how this stuff works and how it could work better.
Well, I think that's again building on my experience in snowboarding or in the fashion or in the social impact it's when you work with people that are the pinnacle of the sport, right? I.e., like the Randy Meyer. I mean, that's where. Yeah. If you solve problems for these guys, you solve problems for the whole industry, right? And so anything I can learn from him is going to apply to everything we do. And when he wins, we win with him, right? So absolutely. I mean, it's a two-way street. But I mean, I think not only do I enjoy it, I learned a whole lot, but I learned a lot. I mean, I took a bunch of pictures, I took them back, and some of our products are going to get better out of it.
What's your daily driver?
Daily driver right now is an Audi RS6.
Those are awesome.
They are so awesome. I mean, I've had so many cars, and every morning I get in the car, I love the car. I absolutely love the car. I lowered it. I put a nice Akrapovic titanium line on it. We've remapped the ECU. I mean, It's so.
Yeah, so that thing makes we figure 620 horsepower from the factory. So you've got to warm it up a little bit more than that.
Yeah, right now it's making 850.
Oh wow!
See, there you go.
Someone at work tipped me off that that's what you drove, and so I looked it up because I'm not too familiar with all the latest.
We've got this rivalry at work. So in Sarah, who's our chief marketing officer, she drives the AMG 63S, right? And I've got the RS6, and so it's the battle of the station wagon. But I'm gonna crush her. I'm gonna upgrade the 2 turbos, and it will do 1,000 horsepower, and it will be game over.
You guys will have to bring him out to like Irwindale one night, an 8th mile test and two night test, and have an actual throwdown.
I'm actually dying to do that because I keep being told by the guy that helps me with the car, like, oh, your car will do like 10 or 11 seconds on the quarter mile. I'm like, yeah, so you say, but let's go out and let's do it.
Yeah, I saw there was a stock one leaving the Pomona Fairplex one night. I had finished at work at the NHRA and I was leaving, and there was one pulling out. I have a 15 and 17-year-old son, and they're obsessed. That is, you talk about the Roadster Shop being an aspirational brand for a hot rodder. Well, my 2 guys aspire to one day own an RS6. So that's one of those cars, and they only import 500-600 a year.
I think it's 500 a year. Yeah, I mean it's crazy. Like, I mean, I've had some really fun cars, some cars that were like more flashy than others, and I get the most thumbs up, the most pictures taken with this car than I've ever had. Whether it's guys, girls, young, older. I mean, except for my fiance who thinks that I'm just driving a mom's car. Right? It's like, but I absolutely love it.
There's something about a station wagon.
Right?
I mean, just cool, functional, but if you have a station wagon that actually performs too.
Now you're talking.
Yeah.
Being able to, have your family in the car, go that quick with like surfboards on the roof is the best of every world.
The best of all the worlds.
Right.
So let's talk about your perspective on not just the Roadster Shop, but your perspective on kind of the industry over the next, let's call it 3 to 5 years. When you look out, what do you think is going to be who will be the brands that will succeed, and why will they succeed? What is going to be the touchstones for the next, let's call it 3 to 5 years?
Well, I mean, I think first and foremost, you hear so much about EV and the whole world going EV. I actually think that in our lifetime, like, the more people talk about our EV, the better it's going to be for us, because people are going to be that much more passionate about what they think they might lose. And I don't think we'll lose it.
That's exactly right.
I really don't think we'll lose it.
I don't think so.
I think we're going to look at alternative fuel, and we already are looking at some options that are like so logical. They don't get enough attention, but it makes so much sense.
He and I had this conversation at lunch, so we're in lockstep on this.
And so when people are worried about the industry, I mean, I'm actually not. First of all, because I think like technology innovation always wins, and there is a place for EV, but it's not a solution for everything by far.
Right.
And the more people want us to go one way, the more our antibody and our immune system is going to push back, and the more we're going to want to do what we love to do, right?
Yeah.
And so I think for brands like Roadster Shop, Automotive, Pertronics, Taylor, I mean, in the next couple of decades, I mean, I think we have an awesome opportunity to do some great work, and not only in the U.S., but I think it's true around the world, right? I mean, you look at that Cleetus McFarland video about stand rails like last week, and how that applies in Dubai or in the Middle East, or how Australia is actually a really good market for restoration. I mean, Europe, I think we could have a stronger foothold in Europe, but so I think that I actually don't think we need to really change a whole lot to be relevant and to be strong and to grow. I mean, we just have to be really focused on what we're great at. I mean, Roadster Shop is such a great example. It's a gem in the industry, right? As a trendsetter, as a leader, we just want to really bring more capital and more human resources to be able to do more. But it's a treasure chest of amazing ideas that we can bring to the market, and I can't wait to do that with them.
Is it fair to say that you'll have your eyes open to other aspiring or growing brands? Like, we talk about the Roadster Shop as being an aspirational brand, and you're 100% right. Whether it's my son seeing a picture of the Roadster Shop pickup truck or whatever at the SEMA show, or whether it's my dad who's like, someday I'm going to have a Roadster Shop chassis underneath some car I'm building. So, but they're not the last brand that will achieve that. And so there are obviously other brands that even guys like John or I may not even recognize yet that are probably on the rise. So is that a position that your company will be in, to to kind of keep an open eye on some of those growth potential brands, or do you want to just lock in on what you have?
I think what we have is really unique, right? And I think one of the mistakes that we could make or that people make is just to acquire too much, and then you don't take the time to really consolidate and build on what you've acquired. So, I mean, I think that what we have is really unique, and there's a ton of opportunity for organic growth. I mean, right now we were reviewing the list of ideas that we've got for the next couple of years, and we're like, holy shit, like how are we going to prioritize everything we want to do in the time that we have, right? So, I mean, we've got such tremendous opportunity ahead of us, but that doesn't mean that along the way, like there won't be opportunities that might make sense for us, and that at that point we'll look at them. But we've got our plate full right now.
You mentioned Cleetus McFarland, and to me, Cleetus stands as the grandest example of the generation of people that want to talk about how kids don't like cars and how kids don't care about cars. Totally out to lunch. I mean, in my opinion, and those are the guys that have stopped looking at all the places where kids do care about cars and how they care about cars. They don't care about cars to go to a parking lot and listen to doo-wop music anymore.
No,
a lot of 60-year-old guys are mystified by the fact that a 15-year-old kid doesn't want to own a 56 Chevrolet anymore.
Right.
He wants to own something different. So how do you, in your role and with your group, maintain some relevancy, let's call it, to kids? Because that really is where it needs to go, right? There has to be generationally a shift back to that buying demographic, that buying power of youth.
Well, I was going back to like growing up in Switzerland and growing up on snow and like loving to drift and like rally and I went to the Formula Drift event in Irwindale 3 weeks ago. Yeah, right before SEMA, right? I was blown away by the attendance. I mean, you look at, first of all, you look at the parking lot. Like every car is modified on that parking lot, whether it's exhaust tips or wheels or a lift or all the way up to a 911 GT3 RS, right? And you look at all these kids. I wish I was one of them, but it's like, like
you and I both, the three of us,
This 20, 30-year-old, I mean, it's equally male and female. It's white, African-American, I mean, Hispanic, Asian. I mean, they're all together and they spend the whole day there and they're so engaged and so passionate. And I love the fact that, it's still very grassroots and very approachable, right? So you go to the pits and you see Matt Field, and Matt Field's working on his car, and somebody like just steps over the rope and takes a picture with him, and he's like so welcoming. And I think there is something incredible there. So I mean that it goes back to connecting, whether it's Cleetus McFarland, whether it's Matt Field, whether it's Randy Meyer. I mean, in every category, like you've got these influencers, and that's who I want to work with, right? I mean, I want to deliver solutions for them that makes them love the sport, like being that much more enthusiastic about the sport, like that Cleetus McFarland video with the aeromotive filters because his sand rail was not performing at 100%, right? Such a good example.
Yeah, and I happened to, I was one of the announcers at his event in Indianapolis this year, and then, my kids follow him religiously. I've watched a lot of his content, and to be part of one of those events was incredible because I'm used to a very traditional style, world of motorsports. And what I quickly realized was that everybody that came through the gates in Indianapolis to see Cleetus and be part of that was there because they felt like they were part of it, right? The people in the grandstands weren't just there to spectate. They felt that they were actually engaged in part of the show. They were that guy's friend, which blew me away. I mean, they know every one of his little taglines and they're throwing out his lingo. He's introducing his friends who are effectively characters. They look at all these guys like they're superheroes. And I thought to myself, like somewhere along the line, professional motorsports lost that to a degree. And this was so raw and so cool. And these kids, if he had walked out there with anything and said, buy this, I mean, they would have been lined up around the block. The merchandise and everything. So when you talk about brand building, I mean, Cleetus McFarland as a singular brand is probably the most powerful force out there right now.
I know, and it's because he can relate. I mean, he doesn't put himself on a pedestal. No. I mean, he's one of the guys. I mean, it feels very approachable. I mean, it's aspirational yet approachable, right? I mean, so he can be your brand ambassador, but you can relate to who he is. I mean, you think about Formula One racer. I mean, like they're no longer approachable, right? But I think like the Cleetus of this world. I mean, like Randy Meyer, spending hours with me in his trailer on a Saturday afternoon. I mean, that goes such a long way with the people you engage with. And that's what's going to make a difference for us. It's being aligned with the right people and working with them.
The most stark example to me on the Cleetus thing is Cleetus McFarland can land at a racetrack in his helicopter and look like the coolest guy in the world.
No one's like...
The Formula One guy lands at a helicopter and go, this guy's a douchebag.
Yep.
You go, this guy's a douche.
Yep.
And meanwhile, Cleetus is doing the same thing. You're like, this guy's awesome.
Yep.
But it is all, as you said, it's all in the way that you relate to the personality.
And I think that's because one is, making a statement about how important he is, and the other one is just having a blast, like landing in a helicopter and not taking himself too seriously.
Yeah.
It's...
It's easy to get wrapped up in yourself or your brand or your, whatever we as a publishing company may be doing or not doing. And I had a sense of that at the Race of Gentlemen. If you're familiar with that started out as a flathead.
I've never attended. I mean, I was going to go this year and then I ended up not being able to go, but it's the one that's on the beach, right?
Yeah, one in New Jersey, and then they did one last year or earlier this year. I'm sorry, I forget, but at an airport in Riverside.
Yeah,
and
it was
Flaybob.
It was in June, right? Or
yes, somewhere around around there. And but so you combine this sort of like retro setting because it looked like a World War II airstrip with these cars and the people sort of dressed up looking like vintage, and it's just. I went there just to see what it was. I'd been to the one in Santa Barbara prior to that, and it wasn't very well attended, or at least to me, it was kind of a smaller event. It didn't look like the pictures that I'd seen of our coverage in Hot Rod and the beach. But this one in Riverside, and then I talked with the organizer on the phone a little bit afterwards, and he was telling me that in the 15 years that he's been running the Race of Gentlemen, people who were at the first race on the beach are now there with their kids who are building their own. And you wouldn't think that, like, sort of us as our demographic or as a Hot Rod, somebody on staff at Hot Rod wouldn't really think that 15-year-olds would be into Model A's and 32s. And but there are. And, when we talked with a couple of builders recently who are younger but are into tradition, and it's just interesting how the difference is, and maybe it is just the approachability of a car or an event that brings people in, and maybe some of the other events have gone away from that approachability, and it's more of a you're just here to watch what we're doing. But it's interesting, and we struggle with that at our company. How do you get younger readers reading Hot Rod? And here we are. I'm hoping things like this will engage a broader audience. Or
I mean, I think going where they are, going back to that Formula Drift event, I mean, it was mind blowing.
Mm-hmm.
Like they were so young and so passionate. I think that's one thing that's beautiful about the car industry, right? It's really unique because I think that once a car enthusiast, it's a lifetime passion, right? You might get in and out of it, but it's
always there.
Take snowboarding. I mean, snowboarding had the heydays of snowboarding in the mid 90s and early 2000. Then the recession hit, and it became like an expensive sport, and people sort of walked away from the sport. Or I mean, you think about golf, people get in and out of golf. I mean, you don't get in and out of cars.
No.
I mean, I was less into cars when I lived in New York for a couple of years, but I still read every magazine, right? You don't. It's a passion that is a lifelong passion. I think that's an incredible opportunity for all of us.
To me, it's not. There's almost like a lost generation in the middle. But I look at what's coming, and I realize that there's a wave coming behind us. So, there's guys like John and I that have, maintained the faith, and there's a lot of us, but there's our parents' generation, which were, the baby boomers, and all of a sudden they're the ones buying the muscle cars, and they had, that moment. Then we came along, and our generation, in my opinion, we've ridden this transition, right? So we've gone from what our parents did and held magazines to now gone mostly electronic, and now we're in formats like this.
Right.
But my sons are in a generation that has had more direct exposure to car stuff than I ever had as a kid. I got my magazines once a month, and I tore through them in 3 days. And I would read them 4 or 5 times, and then whatever. I kept them all, much to the chagrin of my parents.
Pop quiz on number of cylinders and horsepower and size of the wheels.
But the difference is my sons, from Monday to Sunday, for as many hours as they want, can get everything they've ever wanted to know about cars every single day. And so that's, to me, why all those kids are at the Formula Drift event, because they're able to follow it in such a way that when they get to actually see it in person, there it is.
Yeah.
And so to me, I think the generation following behind John and I's generation is actually going to in so many ways reinvigorate this industry in ways that we don't even know yet.
Yeah, and I think it's also like a different. I mean, I think about growing up, like for me, like getting a driver's license and ultimately like getting a car. Which took a while. It was like independence. It was mobility. Like, I mean, my kids don't think about it this way because there is Uber and there's going to be self-driving. Yeah. So going from point A to point B is no longer like necessarily what it's all about. Definitely not for my son, a lot more for my daughter, but it's who they are and what does the car say about them and how do they think about it as a sport if it's drifting, right? Yeah. So, I mean, I think there is the same level of engagement and passion. It's probably for slightly different reasons. For me, it was like, I can get in the car and go anywhere I want. That's gotten much easier like 30 years later. But the passion for the vehicle is still there.
Yeah, I mean, for me, obviously being in drag racing, growing up, I'm very traditional in my likes of muscle cars and all the other stuff. So when my son wanted to buy his first car, it ended up being a 98 Mercedes E320 that we dragged out of our neighbor's driveway and hauled back into our garage and threw it up on jack stands. And he and I, for a year, worked on this thing and put it all back together, went front to back in the car. And he bought it for almost nothing. And it's like, he loved it, and then he hated it. He went through the whole process all of us have had with the project car, where it's like at one point, Dad, I just want to sell this thing. It's all disassembled on jack stands, and he's looking at it thinking it'll never run again. I just want to sell this. It's like, now we're going to stick with it. And then it's on the wheels, and then he has a license in his hand, and I watch him pull out of the driveway the first time, and he had the grin on his face.
Biggest smile on his face, yeah.
And it's like, damn, I remember that day.
Me too.
I want every kid to experience that day.
Yeah. It's really different in the US, right, than it is in Europe. Like it's interesting. I'm trying to sort of figure out I think one of the things, like the size of the market in the US is so different. Like people talk about an LS swap, like it's no big deal. Like it happens in Europe. Like there's so many brands between Peugeot, Citroën, Renault, and Simca, and whatever else. It's like you don't really talk about like swapping engines. And I mean, it's and the market is so much smaller that what you do to the car is, I feel, is more limited.
Okay.
I mean, here in the US, like people they'll do like everything to the car. I mean, they'll do it's mind blowing to me. Something that we don't have as much of in Europe.
That's a good point, because we here in the U.S., we complain, especially here in California. Like I complain all the time, and I grew up somewhere where it didn't have the strict emissions, and you probably don't have the emissions stuff.
We have the same OE emissions as you, but our ability to modify older cars is way easier than yours.
Okay, well, you're lucky. But I bitterly complain, but at the same time, like I really should be grateful just in general, because there is a lot of opportunity, and there's so many things that we can do, even within the and my bigger issue is more with like how restrictive California is, and it doesn't need to be as restrictive on certain things. Like you can lower emissions, but not be so rigid about how you go about doing it. But that's a political discussion we probably don't need to get into. But
I think that's where some alternative fuel option, when people start really paying attention, I don't know.
Yeah, the answer is not one thing or the other. And there's a podcast here on the MotorTrend Network that will argue otherwise. But
there is.
And one day we'll have the podcast, death match with those guys, and we will sit here and share all of our feelings. But you mentioned influences, and that's something I want to touch on now, because there are influencers, the Cleetus McFarlands of the world, Derek Bieri. There are guys that are, to me, authentic influencers, and then there are other influencers who, maybe look really good holding some parts up and saying, hey, I got these parts. And so as a business executive, is the value in the follower account? Is the value in who is holding the parts, who is using the parts? Because that's what I want to know. Is it as simple as saying 5.5 million followers, whether they know how to hold a wrench or not, it doesn't matter to me? Is that?
I actually really don't think it is. I think the sheer size of the following, I mean, maybe it depends what you're selling, right? Sure. I mean, you see some of what's going on with social media. Yeah. I mean, the count does matter in some way, product categories or in some ways. I mean, I think that for us, I mean, I think it's far more important about the authenticity of who you engage with. First of all, because I mean, people have like the best BS meter.
They do.
People read through BS like in no time, and nothing is worse than being called out on BS, right? I mean, you can always pay for product placement. I mean, the best brand building tools and the best exercises I've always done, it's always been when there is a two-way relationship with an influencer. I mean, we give them product and they help us solve our problems, and it's a two-way street. And then when they talk about our brand, it's really authentic. It's like we solve the problem for them, we help them perform better. I mean, that comes across in a really sincere type of way. Paid product placement, I mean, I personally can't stand it because anybody can do it.
Sure.
Right? It's
that's
whoever
true.
with the biggest checkbooks, arguably get the best result, and I don't think that's the case.
One of your brands is Waterman fuel pumps, and that may be a brand that less people are familiar with, but it is one of the brands that has just an incredible legacy behind it. And the amount of Indy 500 winners that, I mean, I think for the last 30 years or something, every car that's won the Indy 500 has had a Waterman fuel pump on it. How does a brand like Waterman fit in with the more consumer-friendly brands like the Roadster Shop?
I'm not sure yet.
Yeah.
You know what? That's I don't know if it's a good question because I don't have a great answer for it.
No, but I'm just interested in
But you know, I think it's actually a brand that we don't talk about enough.
Yeah.
Because I mean, it talk about delivering performance consistently for people like performing at the highest level possible. I mean, we were looking at the amount of Waterman product in Vegas a couple of weeks ago, and it's mind-blowing, right? Does it trickle down to everybody and their need and everyday need? Like, probably not. Yeah. But some of the engineering work that we do, you know, is going to trickle down at some point, and it allows us to be involved with people that perform at the highest level. And so, will it become like the biggest brand in the portfolio? Maybe not, but can it continue to be like the most innovative one and one that perform at the highest level? Definitely, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, I was interested because the Waterman brand is just so good and so ingrained in American racing, and whether it's sprint cars, Indy cars, really all over the place. We talk about in an automotive hierarchy, you know, you have whether it's AMG or whoever's like performance brand, and they're kind of like the technology leader, and some of that stuff backs its way in. Is there value in Waterman being that kind of bespoke, if you will, brand that then is kind of an elevator for the other products?
I think there is, absolutely, there is value as long as the world knows what we're doing with it.
Yes,
right. I mean, if it's continue to be the best kept secret, then it's great for the people that use it. But I think there is tremendous value.
Yeah,
sure.
and it's an interesting thing because you know it's a double-edged sword to me. Waterman is, because obviously where it is successful is in this very high-profile marketplace, but it's a very small marketplace. Mm-hmm. So it's like you're not necessarily gonna be advertising Waterman to some dude who wants to build a hot rod that makes 500 horsepower. But at the same time, damn, like everybody needs to know how good this stuff is.
Yeah, and that goes back to, I guess, the branding and the marketing, and how do you place that brand within your portfolio, and
it's actually an interesting sort of challenge, sort of a fun one with Waterman, right? Because you've got Waterman and you've got automotive.
Right. Yes,
they solve problem like with slightly different sort of solutions, right? Mm-hmm. And so, do they complement each other? Do they go against each other? Is the Waterman guy like not an automotive guy, and vice versa? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a little bit of that skier snowboarder.
Yeah, there you go.
Rift, right? Yeah, and so it's an interesting one, but we love having that brand as part of the portfolio, and it's a really important one. I actually think that we could do a much better job in how we engage with racers that use the product, you know. And we've been thinking about ways to be a lot more present for them and provide a lot more support.
So, John, you may know this. LP, I'm not sure if you do, but Sid Waterman, a great drag racer in the 60s and 70s, and they had a lot of cool cars. But you know the old front-engine dragsters, slingshot style, drivers in the back, motors in front of him. The driver sat there with his legs over the rear end housing. Mm-hmm. Sid Waterman had a car where his legs went under the rear end housing. He sat solo. The slicks were basically this high up on him, and his basically over his shoulders, and his legs were underneath the rear end housing. If you can imagine that, I mean, that takes a special kind of person.
Takes balls.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, It's mind blowing. I mean, I'm definitely new to drag racing,
Yeah.
right? And I mean, I've gone to a few races, but I was on the starting line in Vegas, and it's just the way. It's actually an interesting challenge with the sport, right? Because if you think about rally and Formula One, like you can watch that on TV and really, or even like drifting to some extent, you can watch it and be like, holy, like this is incredible.
Yeah.
Right? Drag racing, unless you're there, we were thinking about activations and ways that we could engage with people that are not necessarily at the race, and it's hard, right? Because you got to feel.
You do.
You got to be there to feel it.
Yeah.
And on TV, it's hard to.
It is.
It's like it's interesting. Like 95% of sports are better watched on TV, and drag racing is actually the exact opposite.
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, and that's a constant challenge for us. Is how do you translate? How do you translate what is untranslatable through a screen?
Yeah, because even with VR, and we were thinking about ways to sort of have people feel the way you feel at the race. It's unless you get the G's and the noise and the vibrations, you're going to miss out on 80% of the experience.
Yeah, it's totally different as a photographer. I've talked with a lot of track photographers, and they'll say how their first experience and how it almost scares them when a top fuel car goes by. And I certainly had that experience the first time I photographed NHRA was myself. But it's you can't convey that. I was thinking like I always like those videos where it's like a street car goes around like say Nürburgring or something, and then a Formula One or pick something professional car. Stagger starts, and then they meet each other at the finish line, and how quickly that the race car will catch up to them. But you can't really do that. You can sort of do that a little bit.
Yeah, well, so to your point, they did it once about 5 years ago.
Yeah.
They put Tony Pedregon, who's my coworker at NHRA, in a bone stock Toyota Camry, his brother in a Nitro Funny Car Toyota Camry, and they gave Tony about an 8-second head start.
8 seconds.
So he was all the way down nearly the end of the track. He was wearing a helmet, and he said, when I heard Cruz leave the starting line, I thought, man, this is the dumbest thing I've ever done. And Cruz went by him at 335 miles an hour. And what is the most reckless thing? Because that could have gone very badly. Yeah.
And that's too bad because I understand liability reasons and all that, why you wouldn't want to do that at every race. But that something like that is drives that point home, which you're saying it's hard to convey unless you're there in person.
Yeah.
One last topic I wanted to touch on with you is, in the trends that Hot Rods follows, and one of the biggest ones right now is what we're calling drag and drive. There's all these endurance drag racing events where guys, race for 5 days in a row and drive the stuff like 1,000 miles. Automotive was actually instrumental in helping to grow this segment with the cable drive fuel pumps, right? That was like the hot ticket back then, 10 years ago-ish. Now you guys make electric pumps that'll flow basically as much as those will. Is the drag and drive segment one that still has the attention of a company like Automotive?
You know what? It should.
Yeah.
I think in the past 3 years it hasn't.
Probably
and again,
right.
it's the companies have been, sold and purchased like a couple of times, and some of these things like fall on the side. But I was talking with Jeff Stacy, our head of sales, and I think he's done actually the drag and drive a couple of times with Larry
Larson.
Yes, with Larry
he did
Larson.
Drag Week several times with Larry.
Exactly. Which I'm still supposed to go on a ride along with Larry at some point in Lenexa. But we were talking about like how important those events are, and we've been speaking a lot with Phil and Jeremy about the importance of events in general. And some of them in the industry might have gotten stale. I mean, I certainly can't say that I've attended most of them. But events and engaging people is so critical. And whether it's, drag and drive with people actually driving, or whether it's bringing people to an event, we're going to be really focused on that. And we should do more of that for sure.
Is the event space in the automotive aftermarket similar to the retail space for luxury brands or clothing? In that, if you're going to have a luxury brand or an upscale brand, you're going to bring someone into a store and create an environment for them that they're going to want to engage with the brand. So is engaging in events on that one-to-one level equivalent to that retail experience you're trying to create?
I think it is. I mean, I want to be careful with the luxury terminology because there's a lot of arrogance that comes with the luxury world, and that's definitely not how we want to come across.
More in the experiential.
But the experience is really important. I mean, you give people like an amazing experience, and they'll remember you and they'll want to engage with you, right? And so, I mean, the more we can do some of that, I mean, the better. And with Roadster Shop and all of our brands now, we've got a great platform to do that well. And I think it's how you show up, right? I mean, we can show up with banners everywhere, but for example, at the Drift event, I'd love to show up and like just offer like have a tech support trailer, right? And if one of the team has an issue with their fuel system, or it's like, how do we just
That's a good idea.
How do we just show up to support the industry with like no expectation of return, but hey, we're here to help. I think those, in my experience, they pay back the most.
Well, for prime example, so the Hot Rod Power Tour, right? Just the mass. I mean, probably the grandmother or granddaddy of all these events every year, thousands and thousands of participants. Back in the early days of it, GM came up with this idea to do what they called the motor medics, and they would send these mechanics, these engineers out with a truck full of tools, and it didn't matter if you were driving a Buick or a Ford or a Mazda, they would pull over on the side of the road and with their motor medics truck, and they'd help.
I think that's awesome.
Yeah, and it's exactly what you're talking about as well. It's like, we are here to help you.
Yep, we used to do that in the snowboard industry. We'd show up with a truck, and we'd have like slap ratchet with like binding parts, base plates, and we would, if you broke your bindings, we would help you out and put you right back on snow. I think those are the most meaningful engagement we can think of.
They're also the ones that require the most effort, which is why people don't do them.
Yeah,
It's a big commitment. Power Tour, it was 5 days on the road, and then plus hour travel time to get there. I've spoken with several Power Tour participants, though, who've been helped by support from vendors on location, broken fuel pump or broken rocker arm or something like that. And most of them will tell me that they're a customer for life now.
Yeah, right. Loyalty. I mean, there's no better way than you give to people without any expectation of return, and you've built the most incredible loyalty, and that's priceless.
And Power Tour itself, I mean, that's kind of its own institution too.
It is.
That's fed upon itself and generated its own following, and then a family event. So then you get the dad and the kids, and then now the kids are participating in Power Tour. We provide that outlet for people, and it keeps coming back year after year.
So one final question before we let you go: as you look at your next year out, what do you think are the most impactful things we're going to be seeing out of your group in the next year?
What are the most impactful things? Well, we just launched a whole bunch of new product at SEMA, right? So water pump, diesel pump, like some award-winning exhaust, which we were thrilled about because it reigniting that pipeline of innovation. It's taken a lot of work after a couple of years of not doing nearly as much. But I think the integration with Roadster Shop and what we're going to do together, I'm really, really excited about that. Again, we have to prioritize like everything we want to do because we've got so many great ideas. But whether it's innovation, whether it's events, whether it's new product categories, I mean, I'm really, really excited. We've got an amazing team to do that with.
This is a great time to be in this industry, I think. When I first started, the thought of building a car on an aftermarket chassis was like mind-blowing. That was like space shuttle exotic stuff.
You just didn't do it. Yeah.
Right. And now someone put it to me once where it's like, well, you can spend, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 working with an existing frame, and you're still got the existing frame that doesn't have the torsional rigidity and all that stuff. Or you can just plunk down the money and you get the brakes and you get the suspension and all the correct geometry, and the car fits over it. And it's just like, all right, well, that makes sense. And I love the fact that now you can build a 69 Camaro completely through aftermarket parts. It drives better than a 69 Camaro
and it's going to drive
did.
like a supercar.
Exactly. What a great time to be in this industry. And it's companies like Roadster Shop that help make that happen.
I agree.
LP, it's been fascinating, man. Thank you for coming in for this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Subjecting yourself to our interrogation here. But no, it's great to learn more about you. I think it's great for us to be able to bring some things out of you that our listeners will understand that the guy who has his hand on the pulse of some of the biggest brands in the industry is enthusiastic, and he's passionate, and he is forward-looking. I think that's something that was important to me to have people understand a little bit more about you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you. It was wonderful.
Wraps up another episode of the Hot Rod Pod, where it all began. Our next guest will not have near as cool an accent. I promise that. He's John. I'm Brian. He's LP. We'll be back soon with another show.